¿Qué onda, Mina? Welcome back to MoNS. So today I'm gonna be just talking my unfiltered feelings about my first impression of Frieren. The full title of the anime is called Sousou no Frieren, or Frieren Beyond Journey's End in English. I knew about this manga since around the time it released. I remember I was going through some forums and it left a massive impact on the anime community during its first release. I mean, simply put, the very first arc of the show, or I guess the first episode, the first volume, whatever you want to call it, it really set the tone of the show really well. And it was something not quite done with elves in the anime manga scene. I'll get a little bit more into that later, but I'm just gonna move on with these basic footnotes that I left for myself. So as you can guess, when the anime did blow up in popularity, I was spoiled a lot by the basic premises and faces of the series. Whenever you found, when did the anime come out? I want to say the anime came out, let me look it up here, fall 2023. So when the anime came out and was starting to release, there was a bunch of fan art and memes being drawn everywhere. And that spoiled a lot of faces of the series. So I know of the memes and the names of Aura, Ubel, Stark, Fern. So I kind of already knew who the big players were. Yeah, in addition, the very first episode kind of got memed to oblivion. So I knew what the premise of the show was and, you know, where it was going as well. I've heard about the stuff with the demons and everything. So all the big things I know. And so in short, I came in wanting to know kind of how all these macro and somewhat micro concepts I've been hearing about actually connect with each other. And this is pretty much how the vibe of this first impression is going to be. So in case I wasn't clear enough, this is going to be a first reaction to strictly the first episode of Sousou no Frieren. So I ended up watching the dub, and I thought they were really good. I have nothing really unique to say about the dub. It put me off that Frieren was as deep-toned as she was at first, but I quickly got used to the voice, and I'm like, no, this makes sense. This makes sense. Otherwise, dub is good. You know, we don't live in the 2000s anymore. That should be a given. Now, before I really dig my nails into it, I just want to give one last disclaimer. All I really want to do is comment on the parts that I find interesting or I can kind of give a unique angle on. For example, like I have really nothing to say about the intro other than it's neat. Maybe it will grow on me or I'll find more significance in the intro, but right now it tells the anime's like tone pretty well, but I have nothing new to add besides like, yeah, it's good, you know. I mentioned this in my intro video, but I'm someone that wants to kind of bring a different angle to my first impressions of something, and that's that fact that I love monster girls and monster boys, monster folks. I love world building, I love history, and that's kind of the angle I want to tackle it from. And I do have a couple philosophical notes here as well, so that's kind of what you should be expecting from this first impression. All right, that's enough disclaimers. I actually want to talk about the show now. So, as a world builder, the very first shot being the map got me very interested in this world. I always kind of like to see how people map out their ideas. In the world building community, there is kind of a running joke of like, this looks like X, right? And one of the most common ones is, this looks like a Britain 2 or whatever, or Discount Britain, you know, all that stuff, or Cyrodiil sometimes one. But for when I looked at the Frieren map, it kind of did remind me of a top heavy Britain because it does have that general shape, the kind of what would you call it, like verticality of Britain being kind of islandy and whatnot, and the top being snowy mountains. So to be a little more specific, it's a vertical and slim chunk of land with temperate weather until you get to the cold northern mountains. So I see a lot of Eastern world builders use this naming convention for their Western inspired worlds. They use simple names for broad regions like Northern Lands and Middle Sea, but then they use Gaelic or Celtic names for their cities like Cool and Tur. I think cool is supposed to mean like, well, cold. And I want to say Tur is, I think that's otherworldly or something akin to that. Like you're just in a different world, like land. At least I think that's what it is. I don't know. So even with all these things of like, I've seen these tropes before, it's not really a red flag for me, because for me, I see that the author put effort into the world, such as where the roads and rivers are. And I think when authors know kind of what the world looks like, it helps them create fresh characters and new arising conflicts. Now, if they were to tell me, rate my world building or whatever, I'd be as critical as you can. I will have things to say about it, kind of the genericness of some of it. But honestly, I just love seeing anyone put effort into their world building, especially something as big as this. So, if you're a world builder listening, and it's okay to make a map like this. Honestly, I'm fine with it. As long as you actually like make a story out of something, your world is already going to be better than most like elitist world builders that never write anything. I know I'm sticking a lot to this map for quite a bit, but there's just 3 quick locations I want to point out before moving on from this map. So there is kind of this interesting split between the central lands and the southern lands. Usually when I look at desolate southern lands and these kind of generic fantasy RPG stories, this is supposed to be kind of like a poor country or a low income country, or whatever. There's usually a reason why something would have a lower population in the bottom and then a higher population on the top. It's very westernized to think that north of the map, bunch of people, big power, and then southern part of the map, poor, not as well put together. Pretty common thing you see in world building. Now, coming in knowing that this is an Eastern author writing elves, I immediately tried to look for the named area by a forest. And once I saw deep forest in the north, I was like, yep, that's where Frieren came from. Easy. So hopefully we'll see what this deep forest mumbo jumbo is about. Because, Eastern authors don't tend to change the origins of races too much unless they feel like subverting them, or maybe they do change them, but they don't change them that much. All right, that's enough on that. And last thing about this map is I'm a sucker for these single overdramatic regions that dwarf the rest of the map. And way to tease the audience. All right, actual episode. All right, so the start of the show is Frieren and friends coming back from slaying the Demon King. And immediately it establishes that this isn't your everyday story. This is a resolution story. The main plot has kind of already happened. How do you deal with those consequences? And, before I even actually started watching this first episode, that's what immediately caught my attention with Frieren. Now, because of that, the beginning kept me on edge because I know what happens to the human character soon. To a fresh viewer, there's a bunch of like subtle foreshadowing going on in these first 10 minutes or so. But to people like me, it's a warning and a reminder what exactly is going to happen soon. So a little random, really, really minute, small, random thing that caught my eye as a world builder. And that's that I love this Mural of the goddess. Food is such an easy way to connect someone with ancient wealth and power and divinity. We take it for granted now. We see power more associated with money and otherworldliness sometimes, something even beyond our grasp. But having food back in ancient times was kind of scarce, especially if you consider like anything pre-Bronze Age. So yeah, I'm absolutely in love with this mural. And also, I can see the goddess has some pointy ears there. They're probably teasing it to be an elf, and I'm wondering if they'll ever get into that. All right, moving in a couple scenes now. There is a moment in the show where they're going to a feast, and everyone is just sort of chilling, celebrating, looking forward to their futures and whatever. And then there's a meteor shower, but throughout this entire time, even though all the male characters are bantering, especially the 2 human characters, Frieren is kind of dozing off, not really caring, kind of acting a bit of like a yandere. And what I have to say about that is the feast felt so ethereal. Even when they were all laughing. It's just such a weird moment knowing it's all gonna pass. But at the same time, I was screaming at Frieren to enjoy the moment. I think, Frieren even constantly brings up the line, a mere 10 years. And that's a line I think about a lot. It makes me kind of think about how easily we as people kind of compress information. 10 years can feel like a lot when you're living in it, but when you look back on it, it all feels so short. And I think that's just, it's human nature to compress information and, especially something like memories that don't really serve such an active purpose usually. And the reason I try to think about that line is because I try to remember, don't think like episode 1 Frieren. 10 years is short. 10 years is a lot. Make use of it, But I don't want to get into the sappy stuff just yet. So yeah, a couple of dialogues later, and then you see Frieren walking off, separating from the party, going on her own journey, saying, I might be back in 50 years or whatever, and she crosses the bridge and has a huge montage of places to go. And while I was watching time pass and Frieren going through her adventures, it kind of made me curious what her past experience are, especially with other people. I think I heard that Frieren has a 4-digit number on her age, and I find it weird that this is the first time she made a genuine connection with someone without an explanation. Throughout the first episode, you see that this party meant a lot to Frieren, and as someone who lived that many experiences, or has the ability to live that many experiences, I kind of wonder why it took her this long, I suppose. And definitely not trying to knock on the show, but it kind of, it brings questions, and I hope to see some of this maybe slightly answered in the future. I'm just looking forward to what's being set up here. That's what I'm trying to say. And also during this segment, it is implied that it did take her 50 years to go around this land. And the land doesn't look that big. So I'm inclined to believe she stayed at a few locations for a long time, or she traveled outside of the previous map that we were introduced. But that's just my speculation from someone who's only seen one episode. So after that very long segment of Frieren just traveling around, she comes back to the main town where they split off from the party, and Frieren finds a very old Himmel. I was surprised at seeing him so old, but I think what I was more surprised about was the priest of the party, who was older looking before the 50-year skip. He was looking already older, and he looks like almost the same, just with a couple wrinkles after this time skip. And that's what really hit Himmel's age for me. So my interpretation of Himmel was he was fighting an illness way before he met Frieren, or re-met with Frieren. They go to a hill and just stare at the meteor shower they saw 50 years ago. It made me believe that Himmel was finally happy because he accomplished the one thing he actually wanted, and that was a chance to spend time with Frieren and his close friends again. So that was kind of the only thing that ended up keeping him going despite all the illnesses he was going through at the time. Himmel's speech about youth, losing the grasp of life, and in addition, his public funeral, makes me reflect on how this show views death. It happens, and that's just okay. Like, for an example, maybe not death, but dying. Even when Frieren saw a very old Himmel, she was still her mind was still in her work. And that could kind of be interpreted or reflective of how people are in the real world as well. How we constantly focus on our work or our studies or whatever in front of us, like our own individual goals, that the people that we care about end up just fading away while we're looking away from them. And then finally, once you see Himmel pass away, we as the audience get to see probably the most important and iconic scenes in all of Frieren. And that's Himmel's burial. I knew about this scene way before, Frieren hit the mainstream wave. The iconic paraphrase line of, "I only knew them for 10 years. I hardly knew them. Why didn't I try to get to know them better? This line hammers home the message of Frieren, and why this line brought the series to such tall heights. And what comes after this line only emphasizes the existential theme of Frieren. Now, as Himmel's scene is probably the hardest hitting, I have one that I want to talk about a little more, just because I think people have already talked about the Himmel funeral scene quite a bit, and I feel there's more to say in the later episodes, but I want to talk about something that I can kind of bring a different angle from, or at least a relatively uncommon one. And I just want to talk about Hatier's little mini arc in the first episode. So Hatier is the priest, and he ended up seeing Himmel's funeral as well. At this point, he's around his 70s when they buried Himmel. And then the next scene is 20 years after Himmel's death. We find Hatier in a lone cabin outside a major city. And I'm thinking that at this point, he has to be in his 90s, and maybe even his hundreds, but I'm not really sure about the age. I haven't looked him up. Now, during those 20 years, Hatier adopted an orphan girl from the war-torn southern lands named Fern. And it became quickly obvious that Hatier cares for her. So much so that he asked Frieren to take her as an apprentice, but Frieren declines. Hatier then takes Frieren to his library and shows him an ancient text that contains a possible spell for immortality or even resurrection, all while implying he would like to live a little longer. During Himmel's funeral, he mentioned he doesn't care for death since there's a seat for him in the afterlife. But now, in this scene, he brings up that was just a front back then. And in addition, he's only grown more fearful of death ever since those past 20 years. I have two ways to interpret this. One is that he was only slightly fearful of death back then because he didn't value his life. And that was somewhat hinted at by how much he was drinking and his recklessness towards his own life in general. But now having to take care of Fern brought meaning into his life. Which means parting with his life, especially when it's just right around the corner, absolutely terrifies Hatier. Now that's the more direct interpretation you can just view from watching the show. But I have a second interpretation that reminded me of a video I watched a few years ago called A 97-Year-Old Philosopher Faces His Own Death by The Atlantic. I recommend watching this video if you want some existential dread, but I want to point to a specific part of the video. The 97-year-old man wrote a book about death at 77 years old, so about 20 years ago. He explains in that book that he wrote about how there's no reason to fear death since it can mentally be overcome. Then the 97-year-old in the video immediately follows up by saying he disagrees with what he said 20 years ago. Our human emotions are irrational, and with enough wearing down, our fears will embody our emotions. And this is how I viewed Hatier. A very old man stripped of his ability to mentally defend himself against the proximity of death. Regardless of what the author of Frieren had in mind, I loved that he left Hatier's feelings vague and let the audience interpret it. But, I don't know. That might change depending on how much further Hatier has in this story. Whew, oh my god. Alright. Finally moving along. But, there's not really much I can add with the Fern scene, other than it was a setup to what will be the rest of the show. Once again, just to emphasize that I already know who Fern will be, and I know her role, so I wasn't too surprised in seeing her, and I know exactly where she's going to be going, probably in the next 3 episodes. But yeah, no, after that Hatier scene, that was kind of the end of the episode, basically. It was just showing that Fern has magical abilities. Oh, and one side thing I didn't quite get to talk about was the dwarf Eisen. He doesn't have much of a presence compared to the other 3 original party members, but I have a few thoughts about him. 1, he doesn't physically age in this episode, but it does make me wonder if dwarves are as long-lived as elves. And if they are as long-lived, I wonder why non-humans bother talking with mortal creatures if they're just gonna blink out of existence anyways. And if dwarves aren't as long-lived, it kind of makes me curious what stage of life Eisen is in. Regardless of his ambiguous morality, Eisen did have a line that I reflected on. And that line is, once you lost your vigor, your body slows, and your life must slow with it. I think this line becomes impactful for people who have passed the 25-year-old threshold by a few years now. For the first time, confronting the first declines of your body is the first step to truly facing immortality. I'm sure this line is more of a setup to whatever Eisen's future is, but I get the feeling I'll probably remember this line more than I should. Oh boy. And that's gonna do it for my first impression of Frieren, Beyond Journey's End. Like I said from the start, or at least I think I said it, I knew I was going to like this show, and after watching this first episode, that remained true. So Hazar, will you keep watching it? I probably will. I don't know at what pace, since I still have other shows on the bench, unfortunately. This will probably be a show that I'll continue watching really soon. I have a few things I gotta clear up in my personal life, but whenever I have free time, I can see myself just going through this entirely. Hazar, will you make any other Frieren content beyond this first impression? Now, I don't know if I want to make an impression of every single episode, and quite frankly, I don't know if I will make it for any other ones. However, if I feel like making it, or if there's a huge demand for it, I could see myself making some kind of review of the first season if I do end up finishing Frieren, which I think I will. Alright, Hazar, what's after this video? Well, first of all, I still gotta work on one of my videos on my main channel. I'm probably gonna chip a bit away from that. Beyond that, I mentioned in my intro video that this is my do whatever kind of channel, just to kind of get me motivated into doing content. So quite frankly, I don't know what's coming next. It might end up being more low effort than this video, whatever is coming next. I could be doing group collabs, or I could just be talking about anything. I don't know. I'll see where my mind leads me, but it will probably be something akin to this. I don't know. But no, what I do have planned is a big video in the main channel, and I'll make sure to put that in my socials whenever that video is about to come out or does come out. All right, I'm glad you stuck around for my first real video of this channel. It was a bit of a, needless to say, it was a bit of heavy subject matter. So I want to leave this video on a more positive note. A quote I really like to remember when I'm feeling a little bit existential. My reminiscing haunts me, and I don't look forward to my future. So by process of elimination, the present is the happiest moment of my life. Nothing else to say, I think? Yeah, no, I think I'm done. All right. Thanks for stopping by MoNS. Don't get lost out there. Matane.